In this video, we'll continue our study of the microstructures that give shape to the second sublecture. Next in our collection is the progression of a reference to self-wisdom, and what we mean by that is the expression wise in one's own eyes. We see this established in Unit 1B1, and then it occurs again in Unit 1B, Part 2. The sage negatively assesses claims of self-wisdom, that is, being wise in my own eyes, twice in that unit that concerns the stupid fellow. That unit begins in 26.1 and continues through 26.12. The first of these mentions occurs at a palistrophic pivot point in 26.5. Let's display that chart showing the palistrophe so that you can visualize that a little more easily. Here you see the palistrophic chart. Notice that verses 4 and 5 together are a quatrain, which make up the pivot point where the poem then begins to turn back on itself and scale back down 6, 7, and 8. Verse 5 has this expression, to be wise in one's own eyes. And now we can read that in the upper right. Reply to a stupid fellow in a manner corresponding to his folly, lest he become wise in his own estimation, or eyes. The sage mentions this self-wisdom again at the close of that same unit, where he warns that there is one person still inferior to this stupid fellow. Why is he inferior? Because this person claims that he himself is completely wise. That's verse 12. You can see it now on the right. You have seen, no doubt, a person who is wise in his own estimation. A stupid person has more hope than he. So he's just finished talking about the stupid person, and then he ends it by saying there's someone who's even worse off than this. It's someone who is refusing to accept any advice because he knows it all. So with these two mentions of being wise in one's own estimation in Unit 1B1, when at the close of the next unit, 1B2, the sage labels the lazy fellow as the consummate know-it-all because of the way that he's prepared this information through 1B1, the pupil then better appreciates the severity of this castigation as it identifies the lazy person. Let's take a look at that. The incurably lazy, as you can see on the left, begins in 26.13, continues through 26.16. And notice verse 16, in his own estimation, the lazy fellow is wiser than 7 who respond with sound discernment. So we're simply acknowledging that because the sage has talked about this in the previous unit, when he reaches this identity description for the lazy person in 26.16 at the end of the lazy person, just as he brought it up towards the end or in the end of the stupid fellow, it rings with a greater severity, here describing the lazy fellow. The next microstructure is easy to spot. It has to do with thematic continuity that spans Unit 1B2. As you can see then, 1B2 is the incurably lazy person, beginning in 26.13 and continuing through verse 16. This continuity is evident from the fact that each of these 4 verses mention a lazy fellow. Furthermore, within the master lecture that begins in Proverbs 25 and extends to chapter 29, this Hebrew root for the lazy, which is azal, does not appear outside these 4 verses. Next is a dynamic progression that courses through this same Unit 1B2, verses 13 to 16. The sage's description of the lazy fellow here in Unit 1B2 travels along a 3-verse vector of harm that increases from external and imaginary harm to actual and self-inflicted harm. In the 4th and final verse, verse 16, the sage issues this scathing dismissal of the lazy fellow. In his own estimation, the lazy fellow is wiser than 7 who respond with sound discernment. Regardless how many perceptive people may observe and attempt to advise the lazy fellow concerning his character flaws, He categorically rejects their counsel as inferior to his own. Is it any wonder that the sage classes such a one as utterly hopeless? He did that back by implication in 26:12b at the end of his description of the stupid fellow. Consider more closely, then, the steps of this dynamic progression. The sequence begins with the lazy fellow excusing his refusal to exert himself, appealing to this claim. A young lion is in the street. A lion is in the middle of the marketplace. That's verse 13. If perchance he should be convinced that he really must exert himself, notice how he complies in externals only. He works up quite a sweat, spinning on his bed. Verse 14. In circular fashion, with exertion absent any progress, he manages to perpetuate his indolence. In the third stage, suppose that he manages to exert himself in a task more productive than perpetuating his sleep, a task as basic as self-feeding. We're looking now at verse 15. Even here, one must not hope that such an achievement would constitute a harbinger of self-reform, for the indolent is famous for his failure to finish, even in cases where such failure will spell his own doom, that is, death by starvation, despite the fact that food is within easy reach. By his failure in these three phases, verses 13, 14, and 15, it's not surprising that the lazy fellow is described by the sage as perfectly unteachable. Verse 16. A wordplay reversal joins verse 16 to verse 15. This operates because the idiom for the wise, who are described as possessing sound discernment in verse 16, this idiom literally involves issuing an assessment or a response concerning flavor or taste. The idiom portrays the ability, metaphorically, wisely to distinguish between what tastes good and what tastes bad. This comes directly after implying that the indolent fellow tastes nothing at all, since he's too lazy to put any food in his mouth. Verse 15. Nevertheless, he supposes himself to be wiser than 7, which is a number suggesting an unassailable group, 7 who are eminently skilled at discerning flavor. The lazy fellow thus proves to be consummately self-deluded. The next microstructure involves thematic continuity that spans Unit 1B3, that is 26:17 through 28. The sage reserves for last the most dangerous of the three characters appealing for advocacy. This 12-verse unit, 26:17 through 28, turns from the lazy fellow of the preceding unit, signaling here a new theme with the collection of fractious terms, such as the term litigation. This occurs in verses 17 and 21. Verse 17, as one who grasps a dog's ears, so is he who becomes enraged concerning a litigation not his. Verse 21, charcoal fuel is to red-hot coals, and wood is to fire, as a contentious person is to the kindling of litigation. Another fractious term is strife, which shows up in verse 20. For want of wood, a fire will die out. When there is no slanderer, strife will grow silent. Another such term is contentious person in 21, which we just read. The last of these terms that tips us off to the new theme is the word hate. We'll see that in verses 24, 26, and 28. 24 in the upper left. By means of his lips, one who hates may go undetected, but deep within he will be set on deception. 26. Hatred may cover itself with guile. Its wickedness can be uncovered through a juridical assembly. And then 28. A false tongue keeps on hating those whom it crushes, and a slick mouth will fashion an opportunity for stumbling. To these, we must add the related negative concepts of duplicity. We see this in 19 and 28. Notice verse 19. So it was that a certain individual deceived his neighbor, and then would say, am I not merely fooling around? Deceived, that's duplicity. Verse 28. A false tongue, that's duplicity, keeps on hating those it crushes, and so on. Another related negative concept is slander. It shows up in verses 20 and 22. Verse 20, lower left. For want of wood, a fire will die out, and when there is no slanderer, strife will grow silent. And verse 22, words of a slanderer are like delicacies. They are what descended deep within. Another negative term or concept is concealment. We see this in verses 23, 4, 6, and 7. Verse 23, silver consisting only of silver dross, which has been overlaid on earthenware. Such are persons who set lips on fire with wrong motives. We're talking about concealment, the veneer of silver being overlaid onto earthenware. Verse 24, by means of his lips one who hates may go undetected, but deep within he will be set on deception. To go undetected and deception, this involves concealment. 26a, hatred may cover itself with guile. Again, this idea of a veneer, that's concealment. And verse 27, one who digs a pit, into it he will fall. To dig a pit, you're concealing a trap. The last of these negative concepts then is the retributive opposite of concealment, which is exposure. This shows up in 26b. Last half of 26 reads, its wickedness, that is the wickedness of hatred that conceals itself, covers itself with guile, its wickedness can be uncovered. This is exposure. Uncovered through a juridical assembly. So once again, what we're doing is establishing thematic continuity in Unit 1B3. We've seen it in these terms: litigation, strife, contentious person, and hate. In addition to those actual terms, then we expand it to concepts. The concepts we just reviewed were duplicity, slander, concealment, and its retributive opposite, exposure. From this collection emerges a unit-wide scene of hate-fueled harm that is perpetrated under the guise of legitimate litigation. And that leads to the title for this unit, which we see listed there above verse 17. Unit 1B3, the title is The Seductively Litigious. To infer that the sage in this unit is specifying several independently antisocial characters does not sufficiently account for the way in which the various threads of this unit trace back to the trouble that's incited by the litigious figure, particularly through the repetition of the word litigation, which in Hebrew is riv, which we find in verses 17 and 21. Now we come to consider the microstructure of progression of thought here in Unit 1B3, that is chapter 26, verses 17 through 28. Whenever we can detect progression of thought, it is of immense value in helping us to understand the cohesive message and the main points that the sage is making. The persuasive impact delivered by this unit owes its effectiveness to a deliberate progression of thought. The hazard that drives this entire unit, the sage unveils in his opening verse, verse 17. Bystanders must be on guard against the empathetic tendency to take sides in another person's quarrel. Notice verse 17. As one who grasps a dog's ears, so is he who becomes enraged concerning a litigation not his. The sage is telling us that such ill-advised alliances will return to bite the compassionate bystander. Lest we wrongly infer that the sage opposes neighborly concern in the case of genuine victims, he quickly introduces the critical factor that betrays disingenuous calls for advocacy. And here we are referring to verses 18 and 19. Verse 18, as a deranged fellow shooting flaming missiles, arrows with death, so it was that a certain individual deceived his neighbor and then would say, am I not merely fooling around? Thus, a litigant's appeal for advocacy is disqualified if it is fueled by deception. Verse 19a, he deceived his neighbor. Such a one parades his illusory injury by means of slanderous claims. Verse 20. For want of wood, a fire will die out, and when there is no slanderer, strife will grow silent. In reality, that fellow amounts to a sociopathic terrorist who indiscriminately sprays bystanders with incendiary missiles in the form of unsubstantiated innuendos or outright accusations. This is the message then of verse 18 that we read a moment ago. In contrast, the sage elsewhere has made clear his insistent support for genuine victims in a passionate accusation lodged towards the close of the lectures in Proverbs 11 through 24. They're located in particular at 24:10 through 12. It's worth rereading that. Proverbs 24:10 through 12. You proved spineless in a day of calamity. Your power is constricted. Rescue those who are being carried off to death, and those who would be tottering towards slaughter if you were to keep to yourself. Suppose you say, look, we were unaware of this. He who weighs motives, will he not perceive? He who watches over your life, will he not know? Further, will he not repay to a mortal according to his deed? That was Proverbs 24:10 through 12. How then may one detect when a litigant is practicing deception? When challenged to present evidence demonstrating the validity of his complaint, a litigant that is being deceptive will dodge the confrontation with a laugh, claiming that the entire episode was only a joke. That's what the sage is conveying there in verse 19. So it was that a certain individual deceived his neighbor. And I understand that to mean he deceived him when he said, please support my legal case. I have been wronged and I need your advocacy to support my case. But then when it turns out to be deceptive, he says, and am I not merely fooling around? He just casually passes it off. He will claim that the entire episode was just a joke. Further evidence that a litigation is spurious lies in the fact that if one removes the litigant from the equation, the entire conflict will die out. And here we're pointing out segment C, verses 20 to 21. Now, the conflict would not die out if the alleged perpetrator of the injustice were actually guilty. Why? The faults of that perpetrator would resurface in new offenses, creating new and actual victims, not alleged victims, and there would be additional calls for justice. So once again, 20 and 21, the sage is saying you can tell if a litigant's request for you to advocate on his behalf is genuine or not, based by watching what happens if you just silence him, you take him out of the equation. If everything dies down, you can tell that he was being deceptive. If one should wonder, how does this spurious litigation ever gain traction in the first place? This is what the sage brings up in verses 22 to 23, which you see is segment D. For the sage would caution us, there is something about slander by its very nature that is sickeningly sweet. Notice verse 22. Words of a slanderer are delicacies. So they are what descended deep within. And here the idea is people tend to respond with just a subconscious receptivity. They would just welcome salacious or inappropriate gossip about someone else. News of this sort appeals to our baser appetite to be regarded as somewhat better than those around us. This is an appetite that secretly celebrates another's setback as a devious avenue for our own advancement, even when that advance is purchased at the price of slander. Fiery lips that pretend to be passionate for justice, in reality hope that they can fool others into believing that their shiny glaze of self-righteousness extends more than skin deep. But in reality, the sage cautions, it's only a hollow veneer. And here we're looking at verse 23. Silver consisting only of silver dross, that's low-grade silver, which has been overlaid on earthenware, that is, to give it the appearance of pure silver when it's just clay at the core. Such are persons who set lips on fire. These are ones that advertise an injustice and try to get people to attracted to their cause, but they're doing it with wrong motives. They're being deceptive. In the next segment, the sage will disclose that in reality, the deceptive litigant's glittering glaze serves only to conceal an engine of hatred and revenge, not of justice. You'll notice the heading here at the bottom right. Let's advance the screen to see more fully this section. So segment E, which is entitled, What Truly Motivates the Seductive Litigant and How One Should Respond. Verses 24 and 5 read, By means of his lips, one who hates may go undetected, but deep within he will be set on deception. Verse 25, Although he may make his voice sound gracious, do not trust him, for there are innumerable abominations in his motives. So it is with supremely strident tones that in verse 25 the sage forbids the youth from buying in to their sweet talk. He explains in part B of verse 25 that their schemes rank as perfectly vile. And now we move to verses 26 and 27, segment F. As he nears the close of this teaching against the seductive litigant, the sage anticipates this question: will the seductive litigant manage to succeed in the end? And so in segment F, verses 26 and 7, we find the sage declaring, no, he will not succeed. For the litigant's schemes eventually will be exposed. Notice verse 26. Hatred may cover itself with guile. Its wickedness can be uncovered through a juridical assembly. So he's saying that within the community there is the mechanism of justice, if properly operated, which will tear the deceptive cover off of the seductive litigant's schemes and expose him for the fraud that he is. And in fact, those schemes of the litigant will themselves bring about his own downfall. For on this, the sage declares, we may depend. Retributive justice ultimately will prevail. That's the teaching of verse 26. One who digs a pit, into it he will fall. He's describing the seductive litigant. One who rolls a stone, to him it will return. Finally, in this progression of thought, let's notice the last verse of this portion, verse 28. See it at the top on the right side. In this final segment, verse 28, the sage achieves closure by recalling multiple terms and concepts that were embedded earlier in this unit. Let's read the verse. A false tongue keeps on hating those whom it crushes, and a slick mouth will fashion an opportunity for stumbling. So we see that slander appears here in verse 28 through the expressions false tongue and slick mouth. This reminds us of slander, that occurred as a particular term earlier in verses 20 and 22. It also connects with the deceptive lips of 23 and 24. How about the term hating that we see in 28? It keeps on hating those it crushes. The practice of hating, evidenced by exacting revenge, and that's indicated by the word crushes, keeps on hating those whom it crushes. This is not justice, this is cruelty. So hating that's evidenced by exacting revenge, rather than seeking dispassionate justice, this also achieves closure by recalling earlier references to hating, verses 24 and 26. And finally, what is the very last word in this verse, in English as in Hebrew, the word stumbling. This line terminal word of verse 28 summarizes the fate earlier assured for the seductive litigant. Verses 26 and 7 let us know that this bad end was coming. That earlier guarantee of the litigant's demise helps the reader realize that although the deceiver may suppose that he causes others to stumble, it is he who ultimately will topple, and that by his own designs. So verse 28b reads, "And a slick mouth will fashion an opportunity for stumbling." At first read, you expect it's the slick mouth causing someone else to stumble, but by now we should understand the sage well enough to realize that he's using this as a double-edged sword. Surely the seductive litigant may be tripping up some others, but in the long run, just like the previous verse 27 indicated, when he digs a pit, he will fall into it. So in 28b, when he fashions an opportunity for stumbling, he's going to be the one himself who plunges in head first. This wraps up our study of the microstructure involving progression of thought in Unit 1B3. In the next portion of the video, we'll continue with our study of the microstructures.